The Chalk Pits, an original story written and read by Miss Worm. I met Richard Phillips at boarding school, St Swithin's Preparatory for Boys. Dickie, we all called him back then, none of this Sir Richard business. We were, 8 or 9, I suppose, and we instantly became inseparable. Our fathers both travelled for the Foreign Office, and consequently we hardly saw our parents from one year to the next. Not that we cared. It was the late 60s, and you just got on with things then. We were just ordinary lads. There was certainly no hint of the millionaire playboy he was to become. It was the summer of 76, that glorious, endless summer, and we were 15. We'd been packed off to Sussex for the holidays, and were staying with Dickie's relatives. A wonderfully mad old eccentric called Aunt Mabel, who had a pet monkey. Anyway, that's by the by. It was what happened that summer that's important. It's commonly thought that Richard's money came from his family, but they didn't have 2 pennies to rub together. True, they had a large estate in Sussex, about 500 acres, with a Tudor manor house, etc., etc. But the place had gone to rack and ruin since the Great War. Nobody wanted to work at the big houses, so it just gradually decayed until it was sold off an acre or so at a time for a pittance. When we were there, the house was more or less falling down around Aunt Mabel's ears, and there was only one chap working the gardens. Hobden, I think his name was. I suppose he might still be alive. He'd have to be in his 90s if he is. Anyway, it was towards the middle of August, and the countryside was parched. Everything was a golden brown, and the cracks in the earth were as wide as your hand. Even the roads had melted, and the streams and rifes that usually flowed through the grounds had all dried up. Dickie was obsessed with fishing at the time, and he got the idea in his head that there was a huge pike trapped in the local quarry. It wasn't a particularly deep body of water, 30 feet or so, but they say you can drown in 6 inches. Well, there were warning signs up everywhere in the woods. Keep out, danger, that sort of thing. I don't know if you're familiar with that part of Sussex, but it's littered with little quarries. Chalk pits, the locals call them, you know, where they used to excavate the chalk. Of course, that was a few hundred years ago now, and the trees and heath have made a good fist of reclaiming the place. You've got to be careful when you're out walking, or you could fall into one of the pits before you know it. Some of the furnaces and kilns are still up there. It's a very interesting place. Well, Dickie and I were lazing about the grounds and pestering the gardener, and Dickie tells him about this pike he thinks is lurking in the chalk pit. Hobden came over all shifty and tried to scare us from going up there. Spun us some old yarn about witchcraft and devil worship. Though, to be honest, it's where I got the idea for my first bestseller, The Chalk Rope. Well, of course, Hobden's stories just made the place all the more enticing to 2 teenage lads. Look, might I be allowed to smoke? I pointed at the no smoking sign. The police inspector nodded. Of course, Mr. Leverett. This isn't a formal interview, and I'm sure we can make some allowances after all that's happened. Thanks. I took my time sorting out my pipe, and worked out how I was going to tell the story without making myself look ridiculous. Sorry, would you mind? I gestured to the lighter with my bandaged hand. He lit my pipe for me, and I settled back in the chair. I'd heard one of the policemen call it Soft Interview Room 1, and it wasn't like anything you'd see on the television. Armchairs, coffee table, cushions. There were even potted plants. The inspector got up and poured himself another coffee. You were saying, sir? Hobden told us no one would go near the place at night, especially on a full moon. Of course, we'd grown up watching Christopher Lee dashing about after scantily clad maidens, and thought we'd be rescuing some lithesome Jane Seymour type from the clutches of evil. We could hardly contain our excitement, but we had to wait a week till the next full moon. In the meantime, Dickie rummaged through the family library and managed to find some old book in Latin. It was no use to me. I'm hopeless at languages. But Dickie insisted it was some sort of spell book. Grimoire, he called it. Endless riches, unlimited power, fame, sex, love, whatever you wanted, could all be yours. It was bound in the softest leather, I remember that, and he insisted that it was human skin. I took it with a handful of salt. He's a dreadful leg puller. Was a dreadful leg puller. Well, he spent more and more time reading this book until I couldn't get him to leave the library at all. He'd completely forgotten about the pike by that time. Every conversation became about money and power, what he would do if only he had the opportunity. It was the usual adolescent fantasy. Captain England on the cricket field, marry a model, make a million. On the night of the full moon, we had no problems getting out of the house after dark. It was as hot at midnight as during the day, and the windows were wide open all night. Different times, I suppose. And I gave him a rueful smile. It made it very easy for the two of us to sneak out. We made our way through the grounds of the manor to the edge of Rackham Woods. Dicky was the most pent-up I'd ever seen him, but by then, frankly, I was a bit bored by the whole thing and convinced Hobden had made the entire story up. After half an hour or so of aimless wandering about, Dicky swore he saw a light through the trees, so we set off in pursuit. The ground is almost pure chalk up there, so the path was easy to see, and this track took us to the edge of a clearing at the bottom of the chalk pit. I shall never forget it. The sky was as black as velvet, and there wasn't a breath of air. It was as if time itself had stopped, and the laws of science and the laws of man no longer applied. Something else had got the upper hand. You could feel it, almost hear it. Some magnetic change in the atmosphere. An anticipation. We hid in the trees and watched. I've never seen anything so beautiful, so mesmerising, and yet so frightening in my entire life. 13 figures cloaked in black formed a circle. The towering walls of the chalk pit loomed over them, so brilliantly white that they were imbued in an unearthly luminosity. The coven that Hobden had spoken of had congregated there to perform some ungodly rite. In the centre of their circle was a gigantic black dog, and though the night was hot, his breath rose in smoky coils around him. The figures shifted suddenly, exchanging positions as if taking part in some demonic dance, and all the while this dog sat there, staring up at the moon. Dicky shuffled over to me until he was so close his breath lifted the hairs on my neck. "They're standing on all points of a pentacle," he whispered. "I recognise it from that book." His eyes were wide and his breath was growing faster. "We should go," I said. "We shouldn't watch, it might be bad luck or something." "You go if you want. I want to hear what they're saying." And he moved closer. A twig snapped beneath his foot and all 13 spun towards us. I was up in a flash and sprinting back along the path, but Dicky stayed where he was. "Come on," I shouted, and I turned to see 2 of them grab him and march him into the clearing. I didn't know what to do. With hindsight, I should have gone for help, but instead I stopped and let myself be taken. The coven had marked out a pentacle on the floor. That's a 5-pointed star, a pentagram, surrounded by a circle. And they pushed us into the centre, with the dog. I thought they were going to set the thing on us. I can't tell you how terrified I was. But he didn't even glance at us. Dicky grabbed my arm. "Don't worry, Tony. Just follow my movements and repeat everything I say." He started talking gibberish, don't ask me what, some sort of Latinised doggerel, and waving his arms about. It had no effect on the coven. They just stood there in total silence. But the dog was fascinated. Couldn't take its eyes off him. It stood up, and like an electric current beneath its skin, its hackles rose and it came towards us. It paid no attention to me. Everything about it, this giant dog, was fixated on Dicky. He spoke to it in that strange, unintelligible language, and the beast simply lay down at his feet. And then the figure at the south point set something on fire. The smoke spiralled up into the night sky, and they began to chant. Softly at first, little more than a whisper, and then it rose and swelled until I could feel it. It pulsed in my chest, and then I realised that my heartbeat had changed. My heart was beating in time with their rhythm, and as their words changed time, so did my heart. Don't ask me how they did it. Perhaps it was some sort of hypnosis, but the worst of it was that Dickie was conducting it. He stood there in the centre of that infernal pentacle with the dog lying at his feet and directed their chanting. It was madness. Even the smoke, you'll think I've lost my mind, even the smoke was following his gestures. "Quick, Tony," he said. "You must do as I do, or they'll never let you out alive." And I'm ashamed to say I did it. I raised my arms like he had and repeated the words, meaningless though they were to me. The song grew faster until I thought my heart would burst, and then, I swear to you, I heard drums and flutes, music like I've never heard before. Then, all at once, Dickie dropped his arms and everything stopped. The silence was almost worse than the noise, and all 13 fell to the ground. They lay in the shape of the pentagram, the star, and all were pointing to Richard. He raised his arms again, slowly this time, and they started humming. It was a ghastly droning that somehow got inside you, that made your bones vibrate until you thought they would break. He moved his fingers almost imperceptibly, and with every movement the pitch of the droning changed, yet they were all still face down upon the ground. They couldn't see him, but they followed his commands. I'm sorry. May I have another cup of tea?" The inspector rose and filled the kettle with water. I fear I flinched at the click of the switch as he turned it on. "I'm sorry. My nerves." I fumbled in my jacket pocket for my pills. It's been a difficult week. We sat in silence as we waited for the kettle to boil, and I wondered what he made of it all. He handed me a cup wordlessly. "Thank you." I took a sip of the scalding tea. "What happened then, Mr. Leverett?" They began to crawl towards us, not on their hands and knees, but completely prostrate, face still against the ground. They moved by shifting their shoulders. They were like giant slugs. Their black, writhing bodies against the white of the chalk disgusted me. And all the time that horrific humming continued. I had to get away from it. Dickie was buzzing, as if he was taming a wild horse or landing a prize-winning fish. I couldn't take any more and I ran for it. I was a complete wreck by the time I got back to the manor house. My nerves had had it, and I'm ashamed to say that I didn't alert the house. I just got into bed fully clothed and lay there, shivering with fear. He came in just before sunrise, at about 5:30 at that time of year. He said he'd joined their sect or coven or whatever it was. The Brethren, he kept calling them. They'd performed some abomination of a ritual and granted him 49 years of whatever he wanted. 49? What's the significance of 49? 7 times 7. Apparently 7 has some sort of diabolical significance. I'm afraid I didn't really take it all in. But the thing is, he actually believed it. He was convinced. "You can't believe it," I said to him. "It's a load of mumbo-jumbo." "No, I don't believe it," he replied. "I know it to be so." There was something about the way he said it, so calmly, so dispassionately, that chilled me. I knew then that he was lost. I barely saw him for the rest of that summer. He spent his days with that infernal book, and his nights... Well, I suspect he spent his nights in the chalk pit. He left school almost immediately. Just chucked it in. No exams, nothing. We kept in touch sporadically, but he couldn't understand why I didn't want anything to do with it. Every time he had some triumph, he would get a message to me. "You see, Tony, it's not too late for you." That's all it ever said. And he put all his success down to that. I nodded. Everything. His money, his sport, his luck with women. I trailed off at that. Even my own achievements he put down to my being there. "I understand you've had a very accomplished writing career, sir." 5 bestsellers and 2 screenplays, but it took me years to do it. "And you'd had no other contact before he reappeared in your life in June, wasn't it?" "Well, it's... Sir? It's a bit... To be frank, the closer we got to the 49th year, I think it must have been playing on his mind. I suppose that's what happens when you invest everything in a superstition. He'd begun to send me things on what he felt were important dates." "I don't suppose you've kept any of them, sir?" "Good grief, no. They became increasingly bizarre and, well, to put it bluntly, unsettling. The final package contained a small burr walnut box, exquisitely made, beautifully polished, and the inside was lined with dark, ruby-coloured velvet. The inspector looked at me expectantly. It held a phial of blood. I'm afraid I threw it away. Naturally, I assumed he was having some sort of breakdown, that the decades of excesses had caught up with him.
"Yet you never thought to tell anyone?"
Well, what could I say? He was England's greatest ever cricketer, the most popular knight of the realm. His last wife was a minor royal. How could I denounce him as a madman who put all his success down to some ridiculous pantomime he witnessed as a youth?
I see your point, sir.
And then he came to your house? He did. He just turned up without warning. Laura was immediately taken with him. He was still very charismatic and arrived with 24 red roses for Laura and a bottle of the finest malt for me. He said he'd heard the reviews for my latest book, The Bitter Circle, and as he happened to be nearby, thought he'd come and congratulate me. We saw a lot of him after that. He was very generous. Lunches and dinners at the top restaurants, and always with some little gift for Laura. I say little. Not sure if the average man would call a diamond bracelet little, but that was just Richard. He had a reputation for impulsive generosity. I never guessed. Then his behaviour slowly changed. The closer we got to August, to the anniversary of the ritual, the more he became nervous, twitchy. A sort of barely suppressed excitement came over him. And then yesterday, Laura had gone to stay with her mother up in Oxford earlier in the week. My mother-in-law had had a nasty dose of flu, and Laura wanted to help her convalesce. I didn't question it for a moment. And then yesterday, I came downstairs for breakfast and found him sitting in the living room. "Laura and I are in love," he said. Just like that. Well, I was stunned. I'd no inkling at all. I sank into the chair opposite him and just sat there. And then I felt a surge of anger. How dare he? How dare this man just walk into my house and announce that he was taking my wife? They'd only known each other for 2 minutes. I swore at him for a bit and then said, "I've no intention of giving her up." "I don't expect you to give her up," he said. And then I noticed the box next to him. It was made from the same sort of walnut as the box containing the blood. Dark and beautiful, but bigger. About this big. I held my hands out to show the inspector.
"I know, Mr. Leverett. We recovered it from the scene."
Oh, yes. Yes, of course. He just sat there until I ran out of steam. Well, you can't really hit a man when he's sitting down, can you? But believe me, I wanted to. So I'm afraid I threatened him a bit. I warned him, if you persist in this charade, I shall tell the papers about the chalk pits. Really, Tony? You think anyone would believe you? And even if they did, wouldn't they pick over your own illustrious career? The bestsellers, the screenplays, the awards, the MBE, the beautiful young wife. I suppose she's not really at her mother's, I asked, and you're not going to tell me where she is? No point, Tony, he said, and I asked him what he meant. He picked up the box then and opened it. The lid was towards me, so I couldn't see what was in it at that point, but I could make out the same blood-red velvet lining. There's no point in you knowing, because you're never going to see her again. And he closed the box. In his hand was a gun, just lying there in the palm of his hand. He wasn't pointing it at me or anything. My heart almost stopped. Perhaps that was the intention, to frighten me to death. You can't mean to shoot me. I could barely get the words out. Good grief, no. Nothing so predictable. I'm afraid you're going to shoot yourself. Don't be ridiculous. You'd never get away with it. Even if you wear gloves, the police aren't fools. They have tests for gunshot residue. You misunderstand, Tony. I shan't even be here. Can't you hear it? Listen. And he cocked his head to one side. The beat of the brethren. I couldn't hear anything at first, but then the sound of drums started up. It was the same drumming we'd heard all those years ago in the chalk pits. Somehow, as I listened, the pitch changed, growing lower until I couldn't hear it, but I knew it was still there. It throbbed and pulsed as if it were alive, as if it had crawled into me and somehow found its way into my very being, as if it were trying to control me. I couldn't bear the vibration, and then the flutes began. I covered my ears, but the flutes increased the pitch, higher and shriller. It was like needles inside my head. Then he clicked his fingers, and it stopped. I can stop and start the music any time I want. There'll be no peace, Tony. No peace until you decide to end it. He was so calm, as if we were talking about a new car or his latest investment strategy. Well, I took my chance and I leapt at him. We struggled for the gun. I got it off him, but he wrenched my hand back and smashed it against the wall. That must be when it broke. I didn't feel it at the time. Adrenaline, I suppose. I paused and fumbled at my pipe. And then the gun went off, did it, sir? Asked the inspector. Yes. I tried CPR, but it was obvious he was dead. The bullet went straight through his heart. The inspector looked away as I struggled to regain my composure. Obviously I didn't believe all the brethren nonsense, but I don't understand about the music. How could he make me hear the music? We found a hidden player, sir, voice activated, and programmed to play a low resonance frequency known to cause distress to humans. Good grief, he must have hidden it when I was out of the house. I'm afraid not, sir. It only has your wife's fingerprints on it. I'm sorry, sir, it seems your wife was involved in the plot to kill you. We'll do our best to find her. I let that sink in. There didn't seem to be much to say to that. Will I have to be prosecuted? I very much doubt it. I'll be recommending that the Crown Prosecution Service sees things as self-defence. And the business with the brethren? I know he tried to kill me, but I'd rather not tarnish the man's reputation. It would be very embarrassing for the establishment, what with his links to the government and the royal family. There's bound to be questions. The inspector sighed. I think we can keep all that between ourselves, sir. I imagine the fewer questions I ask, the better. I nodded. That was my feeling entirely. Your wife's credit card was used to purchase 2 tickets for the ferry to France. We'll soon find her. Doubtful, I thought. Not when her body is in a suitcase at the bottom of Rackham Wood's chalk pond. It had been a hell of a job to get the cheating cow's fingerprints on that recorder. In the end, I had to break her fingers. Shame she was too dead to notice.
Devil worship.
The inspector shook his head.
I would never have believed it.
But he did. I'd worried I'd taken it a step too far, but it just proves that there really is one born every minute.